Tonight, Railway will board 3 historic trains in Australia. Going from Alice Springs in the north, we'll travel southwards to Melbourne. In 1871, Alice Springs was founded in the middle of the barren desert of North Australia. Close to one of the rare springs, English pioneers built the Overland Telegraph Station. The little office still exists today. This was also the first town in Australia to operate a telegraph. Apart from Darwin, Alice Springs is the biggest city in the Northern Territory. Aboriginals, the natives of Australia, make up a quarter of the 23,000 inhabitants of this little town. In the town center, characterized by a typical outback atmosphere, they sell their traditional goods and works of art. The famous Royal Flying Doctors operate out of Alice Springs. In 1951, their radio frequency laid the foundation for the Alice Springs School of the Air, providing education to children who lived in the outback. Half an hour a day, this School of the Air gives lessons to 140 students.
It's a bit of chlorine. Agnes, you keep swimming in?
From the city center, we set off for the hills of the surrounding MacDonnell Ranges. Here we enter Desert Park, a nature reserve where we become acquainted with the rich wildlife of the Australian desert. In the morning and in the afternoon, visitors to the open-air Natural Theatre can enjoy a demonstration of the spectacular behavior of birds of prey. Here you can see how a specially trained bird hurls itself onto its well-protected victim.
This is the other Broadway I was telling you about. This is the black type further up. Now you can compare the two birds together. The black-breasted buzzard has a much more square tail, and what the one at the top actually has more short body legs and everything. As I was saying, there's only 2 birds in the world that has a unique feature of obtaining their food. This is one way they do it. That is, they use the hop as a tool to obtain their food. It's not many animals.
More than 120 species of animals live in Desert Park, originating from the 3 different desert climates of the Australian continent. There are large numbers of reptiles among them, and we spot some remarkable species. Reptiles are widespread in Australia. Nowhere else in the world are so many different species as in this country. Animal life in Australia is richly diverse. With the isolation of the continent, nature was undisturbed until European colonization upset the natural processes. Kangaroos, for example, have been on the edge of extinction, but nowadays the numbers are carefully controlled. We're back in Alice Springs with the very first Gone. This legendary train still stands near the old railway station of the town, once called Stewart. The Gone owes its name to camel drivers from Afghanistan. They arranged the transportation of goods from urbanized South Australia to the pioneers in the desert. They and their animals are the only ones who were able to cope with the hardships of travel for months on end through dry desert areas. In 1929, they were replaced by the Gone. The camels, however, have never disappeared. Today they're exploited as an exotic tourist attraction. Various camel farms arrange trips in the region surrounding Alice Springs. These processions evoke a nostalgic image, recalling a frontier past. As the tourist camel drivers set off for the hills, we prepare for an almost 500-kilometer trip by car through the hot desert. Our destination is Ayers Rock, the most massive rock in the world. Measuring 348 meters high and 9 kilometers in circumference, Ayers Rock is the largest monolith on Earth and juts above the landscape like an iceberg. Indeed, what we see is just the tip of the iceberg. Scientists believe that this rock extends as much as 6 kilometers under the surface of the Earth. It's time for our first train journey. Starting point is the recently built modern station of Alice Springs. Together with our fellow travelers, we wait impatiently for the starting signal of the gong, one of Australia's most extraordinary trains. It slowly enters the railway station. The gong is bustling with people. It's one of the most popular connections to the south, yet it only runs once a week. It's necessary to book a reservation, so last-minute passengers are unlikely to find a vacant seat. It takes some time to store away the huge amount of baggage, yet precisely at 4 o'clock, the train sets off. Following the old track of the camel drivers, the train goes to Adelaide, 1,500 kilometers to the south. Travel time from Alice Springs to Adelaide on the old gong was unpredictable, varying from 3 days to sometimes 3 months on occasion. The train was slow and unreliable. In 1980, the original train was replaced by a new one, which reduced the trip to 22 hours. The shining gong pulls through the harsh landscape of the Northern Territory. Recently, the train was completely restored, resulting in a beautiful interior and exterior. Not only the exterior, but also the sheer weight of the gong is remarkable, 1,200 tons. As a result, the train has a braking distance of over 4 kilometers. The major part of the journey leads through a mostly desert-like landscape filled with rocks. That's all right for a couple of hours, but then you really need a change. The comfortable Oasis Bar and Dreamtime Lounge. In the southern part of the state of South Australia, once again the typically Australian eucalyptus and gum trees crop up. Here the desert gives way to a more fertile semi-arid landscape. This is where many pioneers settled at the beginning of the 19th century. They developed the endless plains and turned them into a prospering region of agriculture and sheep ranching, still the main sources of income in South Australia. Early in the morning, we approach the railway station of the capital, Adelaide. One of the first tourists to arrive in Adelaide was Mark Twain. "If the rest of Australia is only half as beautiful as Adelaide," he wrote, "then it must be a fortunate country." Adelaide was founded in 1837 by William Wright, a British colonel. He himself drew up the plans for his town. Due to its fine architecture and its remarkably broad and green avenues, the City of Light is known as one of the most beautiful towns in Australia, never hectic but always pleasant. Adelaide's best-known nickname is the City of Churches. The numerous churches in this town, dating back to colonial times, are carefully preserved, just like the other historic buildings. The city cherishes its heritage. This is one of the few cities in Australia where you won't find any towering skyscrapers. With its colonial charm, the ever-shining sun, and the laid-back mentality of the 1 million inhabitants, Adelaide seems to be a place where time has come to a standstill. But we have to move on, for outside Adelaide there's a train waiting for us. She slowly emerges from the thick clouds of steam. Locomotive number 520, the powerful Steam Ranger. This locomotive, built in 1943, pulled freight cars for years. Nowadays, she proudly pulls a tourist train, attracting passengers from all corners of the earth. The locomotive is coupled, so the journey can start. From Goolwa, a little town south of Adelaide, we go to Victor Harbour, a seaside resort. Before the advent of the steam train, this section was covered by a horse tram, the cockle train. Our train carries the same name. The coaches of the cockle train were beautifully restored by enthusiastic train lovers who have devoted themselves to maintaining this railway section. 20 minutes after departure, we approach one of the highlights of the trip, Currency Creek Bridge, an extremely high and narrow bridge which dates back to 1860. Not all coaches are equally luxurious. Here there's only limited seating. But this trip won't last a long time, and the view is wonderful. With dunes on one side and the sheer blue ocean on the other, the cockle train hugs the coastline of Gulf St. Vincent. The Steam Ranger is a powerful locomotive which can pull up to 220 tons, even in hilly areas. It used to be a coal-fired engine, but nowadays it runs on a mixture of coal and oil. After half an hour, we arrive at the old wooden railway station of Victor Harbour. There's no time to stay in the small seaside resort. We have to go back to Adelaide to prepare ourselves for the rest of our trip with the legendary Ghan. The next morning, we're packed up and ready at the railway station of Adelaide. Departure time of the Ghan is at 9:30. Since April 1999, the GON runs another route from Alice Springs to Sydney, with a stopover in Adelaide. A year before, November 18, 1998, still another section was put into service. The original track from Alice Springs to Adelaide was extended to Melbourne. This section, with an approximate length of 1,000 kilometers, is now ahead of us. At the beginning of the 20th century, this route was unique in railway traffic. At that time, the various states stuck to their own railway gauges, making it impossible to travel non-stop from one state to another. For example, passengers traveling from the East Coast to the West had to change trains at least 6 times. South Australia broke this old habit by adapting her gauges to those of neighboring Victoria. Slowly, the other states followed this lead. While the last rays of sunlight spread over the vast and endless plains, the cooks inside the train are busy preparing the meals. In the lounge, some passengers have another aperitif, while others enjoy their dinner in the dining car. Just after dinner, a few minutes after 9 o'clock, we arrive in Melbourne. Twinkling lights, flashing neons, and gleaming spotlights show that we're in Melbourne now. This town is called the city that never sleeps, not even on the average Wednesday night. Our wonderful journey with the GON ends at the brightly lit Flinders Street station. But this is also the starting point of our exploration tour through Australia's most dynamic city, which recently was acclaimed as Best Town to Live in. Melbourne is situated on the River Yarra. In 1835, John Batman, a land speculator, passed this spot by boat and decided to build a city here. He bought land from the Aboriginals, and that was the beginning of Melbourne. Nowadays, the city has 3 million inhabitants and 140 nationalities. The big market forms a colorful mixture of cultures and exotic products. Thanks to this cultural melting pot, Melbourne has become Australia's culinary capital. Nowhere else in Australia will you find such a varied supply of restaurants. Melbourne has a rich architectural heritage. Most of it dates back to the second half of the 19th century and reflects the city's prosperity. With the discovery of gold in 1851, money poured in, and so did thousands of prospectors from Europe, America, and China. The gold rush faded, but the prosperity remained. The prestigious shopping center of Melbourne is the outstanding symbol of the city's high standard of living, where money is no object. The majestic Shrine of Remembrance, a war memorial, is another symbol, as well as the beautiful Flinders Street railway station, designed by 2 railway employees. Melbourne is the only city in Australia that still manages an extensive network of tram connections. The trams may be old, but they're still first-rate. We leave the city behind us and head for Belgrave, a little town 40 kilometers outside of Melbourne. Here we buy a ticket for our last train, the world-famous Puffing Billy, which attracts passengers from all over the world. As they get in the train, Billy is prepared for departure. Puffing Billy sets off on a 25-kilometer trip. The very first departure was on December 18, 1900. At that time, instead of tourists, the coaches were filled with pioneers seeking a new livelihood. The Puffing Billy Railway is the oldest still operational steam train in Australia, and it's one of the best preserved steam trains in the world. It's riding on one of the 4 narrow-gauge tracks laid by the state of Victoria to improve the accessibility of isolated regions. Billy's section leads through the nature reserve of Dangaroo Ranges. Supplied with new energy, the old steam train approaches one of the 3 trestle bridges on this track. A few kilometers further down, we arrive at the tiny railway station of Menzies Creek. For years, this was the end of the line for Puffing Billy. In 1953, a devastating landslide severely damaged large sections of this track, and consequently, Puffing Billy Railway was closed. Extensive restoration, however, saved this historic line from falling apart. 10 years after the disaster, the first kilometers of this track, up to Menzies Creek, were already restored. In 1965, the next section was completed, and Puffing Billy was ready to steam up again. We pass Emerald, an old gold miners' town, situated at the highest point on this track at 318 meters. A few kilometers down, we descend through the wonderful Wright State Forest. Puffing energetically, Billy covers the last kilometers of this section, which were put into use again only last year. On October 18, 1998, with plenty of time to spare for its centenary, the train reached its original final destination, Gembrook.